We have an amazing panel that's going to discuss elements of the book that are relevant to education. And so I'd like to begin by introducing our panel. Our first panelist is Michelle Molitor. Michelle is a founding staff member of E.L. Haynes Public Charter School that opened in Washington, D.C. in 2004, and she served as the principal of the elementary school through 2014. She worked with a number of national equity organizations to develop race and equity in education seminars held for schools and education organizations both locally and nationally. The equity work was built in response to the urgency for culturally responsive, systematic change for our most vulnerable students. Michelle recently founded and is the CEO of FREE, which stands for Fellowship for Race and Equity in Education. FREE was founded to facilitate discussions about the effects of systemic racism on our schools. Through FREE, Michelle works with people and organizations to create learning communities that bridge differences and build confidence in talking about race. Please welcome Michelle. Our second panelist is DeAndre Weaver. DeAndre is the principal at Gwendolyn Brooks College Preparatory Academy, which is one of 11 selective enrollment public high schools in Chicago Public Schools. Brooks serves a student population that is 99% minority and over 75% low income. During his tenure, graduation rates, college entrance and retention rates, and freshman on-track rates improved to an all-time high. U.S. News and World Report recognized Brooks as the 16th best high school in Illinois and awarded the school its second gold medal status award. In 2014, Brooks was recognized as having the highest year-to-year growth on ACT in Chicago Public Schools. DeAndre has more than doubled the number of AP and dual credit courses, implemented a STEM program, and is currently implementing personalized learning. As a result, the school has received a Next Generation Learning Challenge grant. And prior to Brooks, DeAndre served as the assistant principal at Walter Payton College Preparatory High School, ranked by U.S. News and World Report as the second best high school in Illinois and 66 in the U.S. Please welcome DeAndre. And last but not least is Jeff Hobbs. Jeff is the author of the powerful book, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. The book was a New York Times bestseller and has received several awards. Jeff graduated with a BA in English Language and Literature from Yale in 2002, where he was awarded the Willits and Meeker Prizes for his writing. He spent 3 years in New York and Tanzania while working with the African Rainforest Conservancy. He now lives in Los Angeles with his wife and 2 children. His first novel, The Tourist, was also a national bestseller. Jeff was Rob's roommate at Yale and a dear friend. So I'd like to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to provide background on his book.
Thank you so much, DeRonda and DeAndre and Michelle for being here. It means a lot. And thank you all for being here. It is really a privilege to talk to anybody about Rob Peace. He was my roommate and best friend for 4 years in college at Yale, which meant we basically sat around a dorm room talking about football and girls. Later on, he was a groomsman in my wedding, and after that, we lived on different coasts, and we talked on the phone maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Again, not about too much because, unfortunately, we're guys. But you know, the conversations were genuine, and we made the effort, and it seemed like life was long, and there would always be time for a reunion. There wasn't. About 5 years ago, he was shot twice and killed by men in ski masks. This happened in a basement surrounded by marijuana about a mile from the house he grew up in. And I could tell you a lot about how and where he grew up in a neighborhood outside Newark, New Jersey, nicknamed Illtown. His mother worked very long hours for very little money, mostly in hospital and nursing home kitchens. His father was arrested and later convicted of a double murder when Rob was 7 years old. It didn't stop his dad from using prison payphones to go over Rob's homework and instill good penmanship. It was a place where Rob and his friends playing football outside were not witnessing violence and being confronted every day. It was relatively rare, but it did happen, and they knew that on any day it could happen, so they had to be on their guard at all times. Rob called this Newark proofing himself. And you know, I don't, no reason to go on. It was a rough neighborhood, but as almost everyone I spoke to who grew up there said at some point, it wasn't Disneyland, but it was home, and Rob was very attached to his home and the people there. Through, you know, he overcame a lot of obstacles through dedication of his mother, intelligence, motivation, sacrifice of teachers. He went to an all-boys Jesuit high school in downtown Newark, where there was a lot of support and attention, generosity of benefactors, and good luck, you know, all the things. He overcame to the point where he earned admission to Yale, where he experienced a whole new set of discomforts, most of them more complicated than money, and most of them invisible. How to reconcile the gratitude he felt for this gift of a Yale education. It was actually a gift. A rich white banker saw a speech he gave and offered to pay his tuition on the spot. How to reconcile that with the very real and justifiable resentment of blithely affluent peers like myself. How to manage the guilt for his mother crying every night the first semester he was away, alone in that house for the first time since he was born. Guilt for high school friends, also very bright, who couldn't go to college because of financial or other reasons. And just the stress of being a student in a competitive environment with the hopes of many dozens of people riding on his shoulders. He was not just his family's and his neighborhood's success story. He was also society's success story. That's a very particular narrative that makes people who look like me feel good, like everything's okay. This is what happens when you give a young man a chance. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm pretty certain that part of dealing with these discomforts, he used marijuana. He smoked a lot of marijuana. I wasn't shy about it. I once sort of asked him about just why he liked it so much. And he said, when I'm stoned, I can just study and chill, and time doesn't matter, and entitled people don't matter, and I can just be me. And as an oblivious, sheltered 19, 20-year-old person, I didn't know enough to be troubled by that. He also sold marijuana. Never spent any money on himself, so it seemed like he was just saving for grad school or building a safety net that he never had, and it was weed in a college dorm, and it seemed safe. Every night he hung up the phone with his mom and said the words, "You're my heart." And it's easy talking about these things to paint the picture of this sort of brooding Hamlet figure trudging around campus scowling at people, which was not Rob. He was a bright, popular guy. He was a student in molecular biophysics and biochemistry, which is about as easy as it sounds. He was captain of the water polo team. He had a group of girls who were basically on call to come rebraid his cornrows whenever he needed, which took about 3 hours. He made fantastic friendships at Yale, lifelong friendships, and he took those with him. Any friction he dealt with it invisibly and all but alone, and he took that with him too. And because we didn't see it when we watched him receive his diploma in the spring of 2000, too, he seemed not just destined, but even chosen to fulfill all of his dreams and all the dreams other people had for him. And almost exactly 9 years later, I was brushing my teeth next to my wife, and my phone dinged, and I learned that he had died violently, pointlessly, and very painfully. And about 6 months later, after the funeral, where a community of people formed who just, people from Newark and Yale and all over the world who just stayed in touch and shared stories, most of them happy, funny, even joyous stories. At a certain point, I volunteered to maybe compile some of these stories, maybe into a piece for the Yale Alumni magazine, you know, something that did more justice to his life than just his death, a eulogy, and it got out of hand over the next couple of years. And in the last year and a half, I've had the privilege of visiting a lot of schools all over the country, from Ivy League schools to juvenile halls, HBCUs, vocational colleges and high schools, private high schools, and mostly inner city public schools. It's been very special. And I've noticed some patterns in private, expensive schools. The students really struggle to, they want to make more sense and draw these clean lines. A led to B, led to C, and this is where it went wrong, and this is the takeaway. And it is a real leap for them to understand that decisions that seem totally irrational from the outside are usually quite rational to the person making them, that it is messy being a person and having a consciousness and having values, often conflicting values that we use to make decisions. They also get pretty unnerved when I tell them that everybody stumbles through their 20s, some with more margin for error than others. In cities and in urban schools, I would say when I visit, I'm met with skepticism. You know, young men especially don't hide much about what they think of you, and they're just wondering why this white guy in the tie is coming to talk about his black friend who was born with a lot of gifts and given a lot of gifts and died because he decided to go back home and sell weed. So, you know, they want to take a nap while I tell them not to do drugs and to stay off the street. And most of them, not all of them, wake up once they realize we're just there to talk about relationships, about how people treat each other and perceive each other. Everybody loves their mother and loves their friends. And it gets pretty powerful because one thing that's pretty common across all the different spaces is that there is something about Rob that compels or even empowers young people to share their own stories, either in the form of a question or a response to a friend's question or just a testimony. And as a lot of you probably know, it's astonishing to witness young people assume the vulnerability required to share their stories. And it's not that surprising. It was one of Rob's great skills, was making people feel safe and unjudged and drawing them out. If you had a story, he wanted to hear it. Unfortunately, he never really shared his own. He was very contained. He maybe you got fragments here and there, but they were really hard to connect. And any negative feelings like fear, need, anger, he held inside, even from his very closest friends. I don't know why. Maybe didn't want to seem weak. He wanted them to, you know, keep thinking he was the man, and he was. He was. A lot of young men have that skill, and how do you penetrate that? I don't have the answer. I think maybe Michelle and DeAndre do, and maybe one of the values of storytelling is bring together people who have seen a lot of things and do this every day, as opposed to me. I sit in the garage and talk to my dog. But I'm thinking now of a young man in a Special Eastern high school in D.C. Michelle's probably very familiar with it. And we were having a small group discussion in the library, guys and girls, maybe 25 kids, and he said, there is, the part of me that is available to teachers and people in my world, and there is a smaller part of me that is me and my mother. That's our experience, and there's a smaller part that is me and my friends. And then he said there's this little box that's locked up in my chest. He said he, didn't know why it was locked up, didn't want it to be locked up, but that's how it felt. So I think we're here to maybe talk about that box, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. If you have not read his book, I really encourage you to read it. We will have copies available at the end of this session, and Jeff will has agreed to hang around and sign copies of the book. So what I'd like to do now is turn to our panel to get their takeaways and reactions to the book. And Michelle, I'm going to start with you. So your organization, FREE, aims to create equity in education through honest and open dialogue across different and collective anti-racist action. Can you just tell us a little bit about your work and your reaction to the book?
Yeah, first I want to say thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and be a part of this. I think the next thing I would say is that I thought that the book did a very powerful job of getting at the very humanity that was Rob. I thought that Jeff very masterfully was able to understand that Rob was a microcosm of something much larger and far more systemic in our national story, and that it really, the book itself really does a profound job of being able to take it from the micro to the macro, back and forth, rather seamlessly. I think how that ties to the work that I currently do is my work is really all about storytelling. My work is about building the will, skill, the courage, the willingness to be open and honest and vulnerable about issues of race. I think when we have a country that was built on the genocide of one people and the enslavement of another, and we don't talk about that as communities. We don't talk about how that shows up for us in our communities today. And so part of my work is to really get people to start to engage in this conversation in a more open, honest, forthright way, where we're able to acknowledge what are the things that we walk into this conversation with, what are the things, what are the beliefs and assumptions that are buried so deep within us that we dare not let them come into the light because they might scare us about ourselves. What are the experiences we've had around race and racism that are tied up in that tiny little box that's core to ourselves that we're afraid to let open and out because of the sheer pain associated with them. And so a lot of my work is to help people get in touch with that, but then also to, in particular, have the conversations across difference. How do we make sure that people of color are in conversation with white people and having honest conversations about that are not particularly steeped in making people feel guilty or like they're bad people. I don't actually think that there's a lot of worth in that. The work is around self-examination and really being willing to take up and grapple with what it is that lies within you so that you can be an active anti-racist and that we don't have to wait for you to come on board. I think the other thing is that there needs to be a more pronounced personal investment in this work. I think a lot of people are watching what happens from the sidelines, and they think that that's not me and that's not my community. Therefore, I'm not sure how to do anything about it, and therefore I'm not going to do anything about it. And I think about this in the way that if I were met with any problem in my professional career as an educator, as a school leader and administrator, if there was something I didn't know and didn't understand but knew it deeply affected the communities I'm trying to serve, I would learn about it. I would invest time and money and resources, and I would make that time for myself to make sure that I could push my own thinking and push the thinking of the others around me. And I think that because we've been taught as an American society to keep this pushed down, we don't have this conversation, it's uncomfortable, well then it remains deeply uncomfortable and we remain deeply divided. And so a lot of the work is how do we get people to invest time and money and resources into building the skill set that is necessary to engage in these conversations in a meaningful way. And the last thing I'll say is I want to share two different quotes. One from a white woman, Jonna Olson, that's a more recent quote, and one from Martin Luther King Jr. From his letter from a Birmingham city jail. And I think that they're both deeply connected, but I want to share them aloud. So the first is from Jonna Olson. Racism oppresses and exploits people of color. While it grants white people undeniable advantages and benefits, racism also robs each of us of our full humanity. We didn't construct racism, we inherited it. But the unchallenged perpetuation of racism is our responsibility. Racism continues in the name of all white people. And that's from something she wrote that's been continually updated called Detour Spotting for White Anti-Racists, where she explores what it means to engage in this more fully as white people. And then the second is by MLK. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed by the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but instead the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. My firm belief is that in education thus far, we have acted collectively as the white moderate, and that there's so much more that has to be done that we have to take up. And so, you know, our actions so far have been incremental at best. With those being at the bottom, being so predictable and have been predictable for generations, which means we've not been doing our jobs. Anytime that there are huge industries like education that are frankly built on racism, people are making money off of this. And until we're willing to confront that and make it so our schools are actually equitable, this will be the same conversation we're having at this conference in 20 years, at its 25th anniversary. So in the end, if we're not willing to have more honest conversations about the history of the country and the ways that bigoted laws and attitudes long held have reinforced these issues that we see, and are willing to have those conversations across difference, real conversations across difference, I think we'll remain in the same place that we are.
Thank you, Michelle. DeAndre. So Rob came of age in one of America's toughest cities and faced a number of personal challenges. As the principal of a high school in Chicago where the violence is at an all-time high, and I live in Chicago and that's all that's on the news, how does the story resonate with the work that you do every day, and how can schools help address this issue?
So, when I started as principal at Brooks in 2012, the school was just getting over one of its students murdering his grandmother. The second year I was principal at Brooks, one of my department chairs and special education teacher was shot in the head while she worked her second job at a tax business on the far south side of the city. It was a random shooting, went through a wall into her head. The third year I was a principal at Brooks, one of my favorite students. I mean, we're not supposed to have favorite students, but this student was pretty spectacular. She was shot in the arm while she was outside playing at a park with her younger siblings. This year, a graduate of this school in 2014 who was majoring in engineering at Northern Illinois University in Illinois was shot 6 times by the police officer that came to try to calm a storm happening in his home. He was on break from school, got into an argument with his dad. His father called the police came, and the details get fuzzy, but the result was the student dying after receiving 6 shots to his body. And then also an innocent bystander was killed. Last Tuesday, another one of our junior students on the basketball team, a student that I met with once every 2 weeks to process the trauma in his community, was shot leaving a park in his pinky finger. Thursday evening, right before spring break, one of our students, a senior student, top 10 National Honor Society kid, got a full ride to Northwestern University, University of Washington in St. Louis, was held up at gunpoint on the street 79th and King Drive on the far south side of the city. Since 2002, my wife's brother had been shot literally over 17 times, growing up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Chicago, Inglewood. And 7 years ago, my brother was shot twice on his way from school, wanting to shovel snow to make a little extra money. I mean, I can go on and on about the number of people that have either lost their lives or have fallen victim to gun violence. But the context that I want to paint, though, is a very similar situation for every single one of the students that go to my school, that live in the city of Chicago. Imagine you living in a neighborhood where every single night you go to bed, you're afraid that you don't know if you're going to get up in the morning, or you don't know who's coming in and out of your house because it's plagued by drugs, and you don't know if your relatives are going to be okay because they're working late and they have to come in and cross gang boundaries. And so you take those same students and you put them in a school and you want them to learn from 8 to 3:30 curriculum that they don't necessarily see the benefit right now. And we wonder why some students are not as engaged in school. Or you also wonder why folks like Robert Peace grew up and had opportunities, but still had this very core way of life that he was never able to escape. Because every single year that you live in this type of environment, your experiences, your heart, it gets hardened. And it's so much harder to break. So the question is, what can we do as schools? And that's something which we're trying to figure out. There's a lot of research, and from personal opinion, we know that mentors and connecting young people with successful people helps and works for some people. We know that giving kids opportunities, showing them what life is like, going to college or outside of their neighborhoods are all very important. But there is no single bullet that we can say that we need to do right now. And the work that we've been doing at the school is trying to personalize and be very particular about the education that we give to our students, understanding that they come from these backgrounds, and so when they come in our classrooms, we need to be very cognizant and aware of their situations. And so we're not going to hound kids for assignments because they didn't do it on time. And if kids need more time, we're going to give them that because that's the least that we can do because we care about you as an individual. And it's principals pushing teachers to think outside of their personal experiences, which is so hard to do because we all grow up and we spend our time in a certain context, and that becomes our norm. But to push someone to think outside of your norm, to say, you know what, although this was my situation, this may not be yours. And so let me be sensitive to that. And that's a challenge for teachers to do every single day with 150 students, to think about individually their different contexts. But that's the work that we're trying to figure out. How do we help students understand that you live in a context, but that context doesn't necessarily have to define you, that you can develop skill sets and that you can develop experiences that can remove you from that situation and prepare you, and maybe you go back and help and be supportive to your neighborhood and to your community. You be an example, but I think all that work starts in the school. Like I said, we haven't figured it out yet, but we're trying.
you. So Michelle, many people talk about education as the great equalizer. Rob not only attended one of the most elite schools in the nation, but he also graduated at the top of his class in the hardest possible major at Yale. He arguably received the best education in the United States. So is a great education really enough?
I mean, I think the answer is no. But I think, you know, hearing all of the stories and thinking that they are individual stories rather than part of this large interconnected web, I think is one of the foolish things that we try and do as people kind of watching things happen from the outside. And so I think if we don't, I think we've got to think about a couple of things. We've got to think about, and I keep going back to history, but we have to think about the history of this country and understand how deeply that plays into all of the things that we are seeing happen today, and that these aren't accidents that are happening. These are very intentional ways that people of color, and particularly black people, since we're talking about this particular book and this particular man, that black people have continued to be marginalized, pushed down, pushed out. And the second piece of that is this idea of intersectionality, that not only do the systems of education often conspire against our young people, but they're often tied together with many other circumstances, which both of you have referred to in their lives, whether it's healthcare, whether it is housing, whether it is educational attainment, whether it is discipline rates that turn into incarceration rates. All of these things are often conspiring in an intersectional way on single children's lives. And education can't answer all of those things. It just is not possible. Education is trying to, but that is where we need to start having this conversation more as a larger community and understand the history of how this was built on purpose to be this way. This is not an accident, and if we don't approach it purposefully and intentionally, and we don't work hard strategically to dismantle systems of racism, we'll continue to see this generations to come. I really think that most people think about racism as being just on the individual level, but unless we are thinking about how does racism show up in our institutions and how does it show up systemically, we're going to continue to be having these same one-off conversations and thinking that Rob Peace is an anomaly, when in actuality, he is a symptom of a much larger problem.
Thank you. DeAndre, so at an early age, Rob lost his father that he loved and worshiped. And as a boy, he had to become the man of the house. So can you just talk a little bit about the need for mentors and role models in socioeconomically disadvantaged and minority communities? And then also just your thoughts on education as an equalizer.
So I'll be 32 in 2 weeks, and I don't know my father. Never met him. Tried to last summer, actually. Tried to find him and was unsuccessful. But when I think about my journey to this point, I think every pivotal moment of my life, like there was someone there, and not surprisingly, an educator that went above and beyond for me. So I'm thinking about Miss Curry, who took me from as a 6th grader and kept me 7th and 8th grade and said, you know, you were a problem in 6th grade, but you're not going to be a problem for me. And it was because of her that I got into the high school that I went to, because of her that I got the internship in the IT department at Chicago Public Schools when I was a 9th grader and kept that job through college. It was literally because of her when I was in 6th and 7th grade, and she knew my mom was out of work. But she said, hey, I need you to help me, you know, learn this computer system to put grades in the computer. And I taught computer classes at the school, and she paid me. It was because of Miss Curtis. She gave me my first polo sweatshirt. And at the time, I was like, wow, you know, this is pretty cool. But with that shirt, she also talked about things that I should not do that'll get me into a situation that I want to be into. It was Mr. Curry, who's the first African-American English teacher, male English teacher that I saw, that I knew, and I didn't know that they existed. It's because of him and Ms. Majeski that I wanted to become an English major and also go into education. It was Curtis and Zetta Cowsen who were professors of education and law, worked in the Harold Washington administration. That gave me an opportunity to do web development for their company, Afrocentric Educational Specialists. And every weekend they will pull me from my neighborhood, take me to their house right along the lake, and allow me to sit at their computer and do work for them, in which they paid me and fed me and talked about what I could become. And when it was time for me to propose to my wife, to my girlfriend at the time in college, it was Mr. Cowsen who co-signed for me to buy the ring. And so every single moment, every single step of my life, there have been people there that acted as mentors, both male and female. And I cannot say enough about them. But like Robert Peace, who had people in his life, that's not the end all be all. It worked for me, and it works for a lot of people, but it may not work for everyone. And so at the school level, what we try to do is become a mentor to every single student that we have. I mean, you know, it's a simple conversation. How are you today? Or what can I do to help you? Or do you need someone to talk to? It goes a long way to build relationships with students, to get them to open up. Those are the things that we need to do and be more intentional around. And sometimes with all the things going on in education, that gets lost with all the glitz, the grammar, the technology, which is very, very important. But it's a simple connection that individuals need to make with the most neediest students that'll help them be very successful, or to unclog all of the learning that they're getting in their neighborhoods that is not necessarily the learning that's going to help them be successful in life. That's what I had for me, and that's what we try to do at the school level. In terms of education being a great equalizer, it certainly is a huge part of the equation, but it is definitely not the end-all be-all as well, because when you have particularly in the African American community, where there's a lot of mental health issues, and then there's a stigma around getting help for those issues. Those are things at the school level we are just not set up to do well, and to provide those services, not just for the students, but for their families. And so, you know, in terms of just, you know, do kids have healthy meals every single day? And yet we have, you know, partnerships where kids are getting free lunch at the school. But when they leave here, when they leave our building and they go home and there's nothing in the refrigerator, and these are not exaggerated statements at all. Like, this is real life for a lot of our students. And at the school that I have the opportunity of serving at, I mean, we're a school of Robert Pieces. I mean, we have incredibly talented students that have to test to get into the school, that just so happen to be African American and Hispanic, and just so happen to be from poverty. And they walk these lines every single day to get to a school that they hope will help them have an opportunity to have a different life. I won't say better, I'll say different life, one that their parents and that they hope to achieve. And just in closing, I remember, you know, as a young kid, you know, 2, 3 years old, and sitting at home with my grandmother, and she always told me, DeAndre, you were going to be somebody. And I never understood what that meant, but every time a gang member asked me to be a part of the organization, or every time I had a thought to sell drugs, because I knew I can get a lot of money very quickly, I always thought about her. And I thought about those words. And those are words that I try to instill in our students at the school that I work at, and also in the teachers that work there, because they see them every day. It's to let students know, although things may be challenging now, you will overcome, you will be successful, you got to keep pushing.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Michelle and DeAndre for sharing their thoughts on the book and the challenges faced by Robert Peace and others like Robert across the country. I'm sure you guys are dying to ask them questions, and we will do that. But before we get to the questions, we'd like to give you time to reflect on the book. And on each table is a sheet with some probing questions. So we'd like to ask you to take the next 15 minutes and choose one or more of the questions to discuss with your table. And if you're at a table alone, I think right here, if you could join another table. And select the question or questions that feel most important to you. And if there is a question that's not there that you're dying to discuss, you can make up your own question. So take about 15 minutes and then select one person from your table to summarize to the large group. So we're going to give you 15 minutes. And since you guys are a table of two, if you want to join another table, that's fine. All right, we're going to come back together as a large group. If each table can just have one person share out, just take about a minute and tell us your reflections on the book or your discussion around some of the probing questions. We're going to start with this table to my right.
Hi, name is William Jackson, representing table 1, I guess. We talked about the last question related. You had some disagreement about who table 1 is back there? No. So we talked about number 3, just related to how are folks kind of taking this intersectional approach and what improvements are being made in the lives of students and families. And I think one of the most intriguing things that kind of came out of the conversation is just the resources, right, that's necessary to kind of engage in this type of conversation, and the fact that there are many organizations that work with students of color, but do not allocate the resources necessary to do work that brings in these issues of race, gender, and class. And so how that is actually probably irresponsible work, right? I often say you don't bring, I'm gonna use bad English here, but no money to a poverty campaign. And so how do you not bring a race, class, gender analysis to kids of color? And so the different folks that I was sitting with kind of talked about different approaches that they use. And I think that's probably most appropriate so I don't self-aggrandize.
Thank you so much. All right, table 2.
Okay. So we talked about the intersectionality of the education issues. And we were saying how big the problem is, but in order to really address wide, like cross sectors, we need to, people in power need to do the right thing. They already know what to do. They just need to have the political will to do it. And part of the problem is the people in power, forgive me, but a lot of the white people, especially in Chicago and urban cities, have to be willing to give away some of their power in order to elevate the underclass or the struggling people. Because if you have 100% of something and you own 97% of it, the only way the 3% will ever get bigger is if the 97% kind of make some room. And we don't see that. People aren't willing to let go of what they have. And they fight for the status quo, not publicly, but in the back rooms. And you see this played out in the neighborhoods. And so the schools have an important job to do, but as a panelist said, they can't do it by themselves because the kids have to go home. They have to go home. If you do like technology in the schools and you don't have internet at home, you don't have a computer at home, it's really hard to build those skills and to keep believing in that. And you're out for the week, the summer and et cetera, et cetera. So I just hope that people in the room will just think about ways in which they can relinquish, even black people, relinquish some power and give of that to the underclass or the people who are oppressed so that we can see more change.
Thank you. Table 3, and you get to decide which direction table 3 is.
Table 3.
So we talked a little bit kind of in reflection to some things that Michelle said, and just really focused in on a conversation needing to start. And so that being conversations in our school buildings led by principals and their teachers, conversations. There were 4 people from Chicago here, so conversations with groups of administrators and principals from around the city, and then, you know, conversations with people outside of the education sector, just starting to have these conversations that are uncomfortable for a lot of people. But in order for us to see big picture change, we have to start with the conversation, start talking about what's going on.
Thank you. Table 5.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So our table talked really about 3 different concepts that I'll focus on for the report out. First and foremost, we talked about in the spaces where our youth are actually taking the time to educate and empower all of the adults who work within that space, no matter who they are, taking a Disneyland approach, so that everybody there is equipped with curriculum, understanding, can talk about race, intersectionality, or anything else, so that it's not just a few people within that particular building or space who have the tools to actually discuss and create a space for students to share out some of these raw and real things that they're experiencing. I think to transition to the second point, can students come to these educational spaces and truly be authentically them at all times? Does that structure and does the space actually allow for them to? So that it's not a situation where I've got to leave home, I've got to leave school at school, I've got to leave my friends here. But part of the disconnect is that, students are able to have so many versions of themselves, and there's not enough work to help them understand how all of those pieces are valuable and still a part of them. And that same appreciation needs to happen within the spaces that they frequent every single day, which leads to the final thing. There has to be intentional time spent around identity development, both physical and digital. And there needs to be some time really dedicated to dealing with the lived experiences and traumatic experiences of people who come from some of these communities. And understanding and respect, too, that you're not trying to turn them against the community, because a lot of the elements that people view as violent are their family. And that's a reality of the situation. But we have to begin to get them to understand their own voice, so that they're not getting caught up in the narrative that's happened nationally, what everybody else thinks of them, but who do they actually define themselves as from a self-authorship perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
What do I...
Next time. Pass that over to you.
Hi. So I guess we're table 5, 4? I think we talked a lot about just how real this is, and I think everybody at the table had experiences that validated what's already been said. So we know that it's true, and we talked about some systemic things that sometimes seem to be designed to ameliorate racial disparity, achievement gaps, and so on. And then those things themselves, like standardized assessments, can actually perpetuate social classes and kind of have this social reproducing effect.
Thank you. Table 6.
Good afternoon, everyone. We also had a similar discussion around the establishments that we currently have in place in our schools, and whether it's a zero tolerance policy or a very lean operational model, how it doesn't leave room to provide the social and emotional supports that students in these communities, in all of our communities, need to grow and become individuals. Additionally, we had some discussion around community engagement, and that no community is the same. And so, regardless of where you are in the city or a town, there's not one answer for engaging the community and addressing these intersectionalities. You really have to have a genuine connection with the parents and understand what the needs are and the wants are of that community in order to really serve it.
Thank you. Table 7.
So I think we too focused a lot on the size of the challenge and the sense of urgency. And after grounding the conversation in kind of personal experience, I think people were compelled to think about the what can I do question. And some of that actually started to move into a conversation about inventing new opportunities, which actually started to sound like some existing opportunities and programs, and that kind of led us to the information problem and the network problem, where part of it is a much deeper need to coordinate across existing organizations and existing institutions, recognizing that individual participation is really important, but this is actually an institutional and societal issue, and how can we actually find ways to get these organizations that are already touching different parts of the problem to coordinate much more deeply, whether those be public institutions, for-profit and nonprofit organizations, foundations that fund, to really make sure there's deeper coordination to think about family as opposed to even just individual students, but thinking about the problem much more holistically and thinking about what's happening with individual families as opposed to just the students alone.
Thank you. And then the last table?
I just want to thank everyone actually first and say that I think this is the most important panel that I've been to yet at GSV. So thank you for all being here and for sharing. We went off script a little bit, but we did. I think we were reflecting a little bit on the, in many ways, problematic notions of getting out and going back or coming back, and how that played into the story of Robert Peace, but also into some of the work that people at this table are doing. And at the very end, we were starting to hear a little bit actually about Zane's school working to really ground the experiences of Native American students in traditions that matter more beyond sort of Thanksgiving, which is typically where there's like a moment to think about that. But how do you validate students' authentic experiences about where they're from while still offering opportunities to sort of break into a different sphere if that's their goal?
Great. Thank you for all taking the time to really think about and discuss the questions. Now I'd like to open it up for Q&A for the panel. So you can raise your hand if you have a question. We'll get the mic to you.
Hi. Okay, there I am. I am a principal of a high school in the Bay Area, and one thing that I notice a lot when our students go away to college, especially if they're a lot of the like elite schools that are predominantly white institutions, is struggling to find a place or sense of belonging, primarily around issues of class, race and class, intersectionality. I was wondering, Jeff, how Yale has responded to this book. And, I know throughout the book you mentioned how Rob felt more at home with people who are kind of outside of the Yale community, but still, in New Haven. So what their response has been and what other post-secondary institutions' responses have been to creating a more diverse community.
Thank you so much for your question. And in fact, I just got back to the West Coast from Yale late last night, where I was a part of a discussion involving STEM students there. And I mean, you've probably heard of a lot of the tension and conflicts that have occurred there and occurred all over the country. There's an awful lot I could say. One is that this story is not meant to suggest that anyone who feels out of place in college is gonna struggle the way Rob struggled and make some of those decisions. But at the same time, writing this book, I talked to dozens of classmates who shared some thread with Rob's upbringing, whether fractured family, money, or just the stress of the city. And they all are leading successful lives. They have jobs they like and families, own homes. But every single one once the topic comes up through talking about Rob, every single one began to express this raw trauma of isolation that still trails them now almost 15 years after college. And I was friends with a lot of these people, and I had no idea. The reason is because they didn't want me to have any idea, because if I did, that would signal a not belonging. So in these environments, it can be this sort of vicious, damaging loop. And it seems like that's changing in a way that young people do feel more empowered to say there's some things that are not right. This happened on Saturday. We were talking about exactly these things, and one of the professors, a biology professor, very earnest, but he stood up and said that he meets with a lot of kids, and all kids have different struggles. And then a young woman very courageously stood up and said that is not sufficient for you to say that. I mean, it's rough, it's clumsy, it causes a lot of anger, but I think it's very positive that people are talking, even shouting, and I think the key is not to intellectualize it and try to say it means this or that because I'm a professor and I know more than you, which in a college environment is very, very difficult to keep it down that way.
Thank you.
Other questions? I saw some other hands.
I'm wondering if the message that we send to young people is you need to go to college, get your education so you can be somebody and do great things and, operate outside of your community and get out. I feel like sometimes we don't instill in students, African American students, Latino students have a very strong community, family connection, whereas other maybe European backgrounds have more of an individualistic kind of background where you achieve as an individual. And so that tie to the family is very strong, and I don't think it's always fully acknowledged or realized by some of the teachers because they feel like the influence of the school can maybe outpower the influence at home, and sometimes that happens. But I'm just throwing this out there as a comment, maybe somewhere there's a question in there, but can we do a better job of educating students, low-income minority students, and helping the community that you're from and giving back and going back and using your degree to uplift the community? Do you think that would have a bigger effect on changing the trajectory of the community or other people's lives? Because I feel like, I go to an Ivy League school, and now I'm an investment banker, I'm working on Wall Street, and I'm doing really, really well, is maybe not as effective as a change agent. Am I making sense?
Yeah, do you mind if I respond, and then I would love to hear what you guys think about it, because I think thank you, and it really relates to what you said a moment ago about this troubling notion of getting out. It's sort of a societal notion tied to a lot of things Michelle was talking about earlier. And Rob certainly didn't subscribe to it. And I mentioned this trope of society's success story and the burden of that. And what happened with Rob is he graduated from Yale. He'd overcome a lot. But up until that moment, the energy around him was very positive. He straight A's and an athlete and a leader and a scientist. He was going to go accomplish all these things according to a very tight blueprint. And then he departed from that blueprint. He went back home, which is what almost everyone around him told him not to do, and he taught high school for 4 years. And what was a very good teacher, was voted Teacher of the Year. He maybe wasn't a lifer. He wasn't very patient with the bureaucracy, but changed a lot of lives. At the same time, all the noise was that you're too good to be in Newark, you're too smart to teach biology to 16-year-olds, and you're going to wake up in 20 years and wonder where all that potential went. And I wonder if, that noise, as well-intentioned as it was from a lot of people, if it could have been tempered and recognized that it is virtuous to teach high school anywhere, but particularly where you went to school, that maybe he would have had more clarity, and maybe the other people around him would have had more clarity too. I think people get wrapped up in this word potential, which is important. It's a motivator. It's about dreams, but it's also an abstraction by definition. It's what you haven't accomplished yet, and it also suggests that we are all allotted the same, 70 or 80 years on Earth, which is not the case, and in some communities it's really not the case.
Yeah, that's a tough question, comment, but I see it as being both, right? So I think getting out could be very psychological, because oftentimes when kids who live in very extreme poverty or in very tough neighborhoods, if that's all that they see day in and day out, like there's an absolute need to want to get out. Like that is true, but that doesn't mean that you cannot come back and do good work, or that you can't work with the people in your community as you are psychologically getting out. Many kids don't know that there are places that you can get out to. And so it's like the exposure to life outside of your neighborhood or your block, that there is a different part of your city that exists. For me, I didn't experience downtown Chicago or north side Chicago until I was, way in high school and college. And I'm still learning more about the city in which I grew up in, even to this day, because I can do it now. But I think the reality is that we cannot be insensitive to the idea that there is a need to get out. And I'm phrasing that in the context of psychologically getting out and giving kids choice. Like, you can choose to go someplace else. You do not have to be beholden to your community because you grew up in that community. Like, you can go live wherever you want to live, and you can support your community in any way that you deem worthy. So I don't think there's a requirement to do either or. You can do both. And personally, I know that's something I've struggled with. Like, where do I live in Chicago? Do I want to go live in the neighborhood that I lived in? No, I don't. I have 2 little girls that I'm very concerned about, and that's a choice that we made very intentionally. But do I work in one of the second toughest neighborhood in the city of Chicago? Absolutely. And that's also an intentional choice. And so I think it does, like I said, it doesn't have to be either or. It can truly be both.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that that's the narrative that is told to certain communities and not to others, systemically. Like, I don't hear people in like Westchester being like, you better go back and serve your community. I think it's a trope that is like very steeped in, you need to be the ones to fix this mess you made. Racism is something that was created by white people and blamed on people of color. And so unless we're willing to like think about like, what does it mean to really have a different conversation about this? Because we're not telling, I don't feel like that's a conversation that is blanketed across our nation and across our communities. So that's the only perspective I would add to that.
Yeah, I just had a question in terms of when we look at what failed. I think this story kind of hunts me in ways because I grew up in an inner city neighborhood as well and saw a lot of the things that lived in right outside of Newark for a long time. So I can relate to that, and especially going to a PWI, predominantly white institution when I went to college, and then having to come back into the neighborhood. So I know exactly what that feels like. But it seems to me that, we're missing, we talked about a little bit about what it means when talent and youth of color go to these predominantly white institutions like Yale, and you're black faces in white places, and what that does to a person psychologically. Because in ways I'm thinking like, well, what happened? I'm trying to figure it out. But a lot of the community, if the messaging was from the community that he was in at Yale, is that you don't need to go there because you're better than that, he probably did it to rebel, because you tell me not to go back to my hometown where I was born and raised because I'm better than that, but I'm rooted in that. So, it's this whole conversation about, you tell me I'm better than that, but I'm like, this is part of me. This is the neighborhood that made me. I'm going to do the opposite. So it's that whole mental message that we're giving these kids that either, and they can take it either way, either they're going to go there because you say they shouldn't be because they're better than, or they may go the opposite way. And then in this whole thing that goes on in your head about, should I go back or should I not? So I just feel so moved that the community failed Robert. The community failed Robert. Yale community failed Robert. There's no doubt about it. I'm sorry if you work there, but I mean, it is what it is. They failed this student. They absolutely failed this student. The community that he went back to failed as well. And so that's just, I don't know, it's not, I don't know if I have a question, but it's just something that I'm trying to process in how we are preparing youth from these communities to go. We
had a question up here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I had a question just around, and this is interesting considering what you just said, Michelle, about this, the onus that's often put on kids from low-income neighborhoods, particularly kids of color, to kind of be these saviors of their community. And I guess I juxtapose that across the stat that I always sticks out in my head about the income return gap for kids that go to college. And for folks that don't know the numbers, the wealth gap, the wealth return for going to college for white kids is above $60,000. For Black and Latino kids, that number is below $5,000. I forget the percentage because it depresses me. But I think my point here is that we tell kids go to school and everything will be all right and you will get out, right? As if middle class Black folks don't deal with racism and it doesn't hurt them in disproportionate ways, right? So what are you actually getting out from? Which brings me to my question of how, if any, and how would we actually engage students in thinking about how do they create new systems that actually make the systems of racism less powerful, right? How do we actually be really intentional about the lessons that kids are participating in schools actually are disruptive to racism or make racism, the power of racism, irrelevant?
You're looking at me? I was looking at you. I think that's a powerful question. I think it hits on a couple of things. I think the first is that kids' voices are almost completely irrelevant in most people's understanding of how to approach education. Those are not the valued voices at the table. And the second largest disenfranchised is parents. We think that parents and students who are living their own lives can't also be the architects of their own liberation, and I think that is a large falsehood. And so I think that if we're looking for new ways forward, I think a couple of things have to happen. I think people who wield systemic power need to be willing to do that in a more conscious way, and understand all of the things at play, but then also understand that we are by no means in a post-racial society by any stretch of the imagination. And I think until people are willing to engage in real direct conversations about race and racism in the pluralistic ways that it plays out in society, that needs to happen in conjunction with really allowing those voices of students and families to work together with the people who want to make change. I don't know, we need to bring those voices into the room, but I don't think that those things can happen separate of each other. I think that there's so many people here who are good people who wield huge systemic power. And how can you figure out how to make sure that the voices at the table for any of the decisions you are making are representative of the people that you think you're trying to serve?
Oh, yeah, it's really good. I think in a more practical sense, some of the work that we're doing in Chicago and in schools across the country is looking at how do you redesign schools using this idea of design thinking process, where you engage the people in which you're trying to create the solution for. Like, you ask them what do you need, or what can we do, or how do we fix this, and just to include them in that process. So I think organizations like the Chicago Public Education Fund and Leap Innovations and other philanthropic groups that have access to resources that can support out-of-the-box thinking and redesign for schools can get students of all students, but particularly students that are underrepresented, at the table to be a part of that conversation of how they redesign their schools. And even more granular with, like, what do they learn? So this conference, I mean, you go to any room, folks are talking about personalizing learning and giving kids agency and choice and all these things, which I subscribe to wholeheartedly. And so I think that may be the conduit in which schools are now trying to give more voice to students. We were talking while you all were talking about with the advent of social media, how students have so much more voice, and people are listening to what students say because of movements like Black Lives Matter, and because of Twitter and Snapchat and YouTube, where these videos go viral with students advocating and speaking truth to power. I was giving an example of a student situated in Chicago where there were some grumblings at a program, Gallery 37, an arts program, was going to be cut. And one of my students is very proud of her. She's a poet, and she led this kind of civil, push to say, hey, no, this is important to us. This is an outlet for us. We use this. We want to have we want this program to stay. Create a documentary on the program. Organized and got a permit to kind of shut a part of Chicago down during rush hour in downtown. I think folks got wind of it. They had some very important people come meet with these students, engagement conversation. When they left that meeting, those students received more equipment, so cameras and just more resources, and the promise that the program would not go away in light of $1 billion budget deficit in the city of Chicago. So when we talk about choice now, I feel like students, I think that's evolving, and kids have more opportunity to utilize their cell phones and these devices to say what they feel, and people are listening.
Any final questions? We have time for one more question. Okay, well, I would like to thank our panel, Michelle and DeAndre, and the author, Jeff, and thank all of you. And if anyone would like their book signed, Jeff has agreed to hang around and sign copies of your book. Thank you.